Not sure if correct subreddit, not paranormal, and a true story. I was in the military, a field training exercise, deprived of sleep, had an encounter with the dark forest and the human subconscious. We had been out 4 days at this point with almost no sleep. We were a 4-man squad operating completely independently, securing battalion-level safe data traffic. Got an order to relocate about 100 kilometers south to the coast. The day turned out to be quite long, and long story short, we were at combat readiness in the new location at 3 a.m. As the squad leader, I decided to take first watch and let the guys get some well-deserved rest. So I grabbed my gear and started walking towards our guard position down the road from our camp. Guard position in this context meant a concealed position in a ditch with a good view down the road. I got to the spot. It was just over 200 meters from our equipment. There was a bit of snow on the ground, the sky was clear, and it was absolutely dead silent in the woods. I just laid on my back, leaning out the bank of the ditch. This spot was lower than our camp, down the road into kind of a small valley, and it was a thick spruce tree forest, so all sounds that there would have been in our camp on higher ground and almost on the shore, could hear the sea from our camp, just died down. I was dead tired. I laid there on my back, just staring at a few stars peeking through the branches of the spruce trees, until I realized it wasn't as silent as I had initially thought, and that I could actually hear sounds from the woods behind my back. Just the most subtle little cracks, rustles, and other natural sounds. But as I concentrated on them, it was almost loud. Those little rustles became almost overwhelming sounds. And suddenly, I felt this fear of something. I immediately opened my eyes and jumped up, looking behind me into the dark forest. I didn't see anything, but I had this unexplainable sense of being extremely vulnerable, like something was preying on me. I just gripped my rifle harder and even flicked off the safety and kept looking into every direction because I was completely circled by the thick, dark forest. I did have 4 mags of blanks on me, so I thought if nothing else, full auto blank fire is a good way to scare away predators. Although, in these parts, it was quite unlikely to run into anything that would pose a threat to a human. The weird part was that I couldn't control my reaction at all. I was able to think clearly and tell myself that this is idiotic. There's absolutely no threat out there and no reason to be afraid. But it was like different parts of my brain weren't able to communicate with each other, because while I did realize that there is no threat out there, and this reaction is very unnecessary, at the same time, the feeling of dread became deeper and deeper. Do you know the feeling like having an invisible force pulling you down, almost like you weigh 1,000 pounds? I was looking out to the forest, and the darkness was just swallowing me up, almost like it was getting closer to me from all directions, almost like the darkness itself was a sort of being, and the sounds from the forest became totally exaggerated. At this point, I'm in the middle of the road on one knee, and the light snow covering the road seems like the only thing I can see anymore. It was like this tiny island in the middle of a void of darkness, a darkness that was just trying to overpower and get me. The guys were sleeping just 200 meters away from me, but it felt like it could have just as well been light years away, like everything was light years away, like I was completely separated from everything I know on a totally different plane of existence. Like being lost at sea, I was lost in the dark, drowning in it. What made this such a weird experience is that it truly was like one half of my brain went completely rogue. The other half was talking sense and being calm, and the other refused to listen and was ringing every alarm bell. It was like I was calm and panicked at the same time. At some point, the reasonable part of my brain took control, and shit just calmed down. I stood there thinking, what in the Blair Witch Project fuck was that? I'm not sure how long that experience lasted. It felt like a short moment, but it definitely lasted longer than it felt. At some point not too long after, one of the guys came down the road to release me from watch duty, smoked a cigarette and chatted for a bit, and then I walked back to camp, crawled into my sleeping bag, still just thinking about it. I never told anybody about that actually. I think I just allowed myself to sleep the next morning. I never experienced anything like it before or after. Sleep deprivation is a hell of a drug, kids, and I think that it's always a bad trip. Definitely learn from that and make sure all of us got more sleep from that day on. So I grew up in the woods and have many stories about strange goings-on. But this one happened a few weeks ago, and I just found this sub, and this seems like a good place to put this. I have just left my mother's house and was driving back to mine down a back road I've driven down many times before. I know this road like the back of my hand and could drive down it with my eyes closed in reverse. No, I haven't actually done that. As I was getting to the halfway point down this road, there was a thick fog, which is nothing new as there is fog on this road all the time. However, I was driving slowly and started taking turns I don't remember. There was a 90-degree right when it should have been left, followed by a wide left turn that felt like a full circle. Then I drove straight for about 5 minutes with no hills or drops, and that road has never had a flat section that long. There was then a left turn up a hill. As I was going up, all the hair stood up on my body and I almost turned around there, but I decided to keep going, 'cause I don't know why. This is when I pulled my gun from my glove box and had it on my lap. When I looked back to the road, some dude was just crouched in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes and he didn't even flinch. I figured it was just some dude going frog hunting or some shit, as many people on that road do just that. I honked my horn and the guy stood up. He was massive, like at least 7.5 feet tall, thin as a mother, and his arms were just too long. It looked like he didn't have any clothes on either. I laid on the horn again and clicked off the safety on my pistol, just in case. He turned his head to what seemed like almost a full 180 degrees, and his head had that predator glow, like a wolf or cat, and I raised my gun and leaned out the window, telling him to get lost. He took a few steps towards me, and I know that this was stupid, but I tried to pull the trigger, and my gun just didn't fire. Hammer clicked, and no boom. I whipped the car around faster than I've ever done before, then just flew down the road, at least 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. About 30 seconds after I turned around, I realized that I recognized all the turns and hills. I was driving down the road like I had never taken that first night. I went back during the day and still don't know where I took a wrong turn. There are no side streets down that road that are paved, and certainly no straightaway as long as the one I drove. I went to the range a day or two later and put that same round in the chamber, and it fired no problem. I have no idea what happened. I also don't drive that way at night anymore. Please tell me if someone knows what I saw. None of my friends believe me, and even my mother doesn't. I know I'm not crazy. I know that this happened. I'll give any extra details if you need. Just please tell me what happened. This is really fucking with me. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life, we spent a lot of time out in that forest camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. One place that Dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew this place as Spike's hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 90s and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same, that straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place that we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point, but Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip when I was a teenager got strange real quick. My friends and I all piled into my dad's 4x4, and we were driving through the bush to Spike's so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property, and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd be sat if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property. I pointed out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's as he usually did, he said that he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but if the figure was still there when we came back through, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just drove us through the forest a bit, and when we came back, I spotted the slumped-over cowboy again, never having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors, and drove off the farm, much faster than he ever drove on those dirt forest roads. My friend and I looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best, dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened after that, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was off once we got there, more so than usual that day though. My mates jumped out of the car, but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut, for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding this place, and I was going to explore it, goddammit. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back at any minute, or that they had never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from crosshatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged to the shell wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figured that whatever has been there had been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever, actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby's sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another, then a shirt, then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get the fuck out. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there, and there's no way anything good had come of having a child's clothes right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our shit and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying that weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboy or the kid's clothes. But I can tell you, I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again.